Good morning and welcome back to the second day of our workshop. I hope you had a nice evening and had a chance to interact with some of your colleagues and think about what you heard yesterday and get ready for what I hope will be a very exciting set of sessions today. I want to talk a little bit about what we learned yesterday and our goals for the next few hours. Yesterday we asked you to think about the core motivations for your centers, the ones you are planning, to consider how you'll catalyze new scientific breakthroughs and social innovation and impact through convergence research. We focused on some important practical aspects of teamwork and team science. Today we're going to take a step up to the center level. We'll hear from speakers who will provide insights from their own experiences and link to theory on organizational structure and development, all with an eye toward understanding how new centers can be organized to be successful. We'll conclude the morning with talks on the challenges of measuring value, understanding how to think about what impact is and assessing it in logical ways. As you can see from your agenda, we'll hear about the future of engineering centers during a working lunch, and we'll conclude with remarks after lunch from the leadership of NSF's Engineering Directorate. It is indeed a full schedule, though we promise to get you out on time. But more than that, we hope to continue to provide you with useful information and insights, not only as you consider centers that that the planning grants are focused on, but as we heard from NSF yesterday, how you might use this kind of information to impact other forms of research and other ways of doing business on your campuses in a much broader sense. Shortly, probably within the next 2 weeks, presentations and some of the filming that we've done here will become available on a website. This is the general link. It's not there yet. It's not live, but you'll be able to look for that probably within 2 to 3 weeks, depending on how quickly all the media can get put up. Also, look for an email from them alerting you to the fact that that will be appearing there, so you'll be able to link in and see some of these presentations as they become available. And then the third announcement is please look for an email regarding a follow-up survey. We would really like you to do that survey. Again, we're trying to understand how we can do this better. We're very, very grateful for those of you who have filled out the original survey request, but please don't forget that there'll be another survey coming, and we really hope to hear back from you regarding the efficacy of our efforts and how useful this was for you. So with that as housekeeping, we're gonna transition now to a set of talks at a session on center process and organizational theory to maximize success. As we've done throughout this entire workshop, we're going to start with an overview, a presentation, and that will set the stage for a panel discussion that will occur after a short break. I'm really pleased to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Steve Kozlowski. Dr. Kozlowski is professor of organizational psychology at Michigan State University. He is a fellow of the American Psychological Association, the Association for Psychological Science, and the International Association for Applied Psychology, as well as the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psych. He is an editor of numerous publications, including the Handbook of Organizational Psychology and the Organizational Psychology series. Of special importance today, Professor Kozlowski's research and expertise focuses on various aspects of the design of active learning, simulation, and synthetic experience to develop adaptive skills, systems for enhancing team learning and team effectiveness, and the role of team leaders in shaping team development. Please welcome Dr. Kozlowski.
Okay, well, thanks very much for inviting me to this very interesting workshop. Pretty wide-ranging. I thought that was a pretty fascinating opening discussion, really nice visceral treatment to the concept of convergence. What I'm going to talk about is related but distinctly different. So as mentioned, I'm an organizational psychologist. No, I'm not analyzing you. We study systems, particularly people in a workplace. My professional organization is called SIOP, the Society for Industrial Organizational Psychology. I'm past president, and I'm currently the research and science officer. And our tagline is Science for a Smarter Workplace. Now, you might not appreciate that because a lot of workplaces you may not experience as there being principles for how they could be better, but in fact there are. And I'm going to focus particularly my remarks on the science of team effectiveness. So hopefully I will have some concepts that you'll find of use in the future. Let me point out that this is an overview, it's not training, so you'll find some interesting concepts here. And of course, because there's an evidence base behind what I'm talking about, you can go and get in and gather some deeper knowledge about it. I've done my best to de-jargon this, although some of the concept labels are legit so that you can find them in the literature, but hopefully this is fairly approachable. So the agenda today, I'm going to talk about fundamental forces in organizational systems. I'm going to talk about some of the forces that drive functioning and effectiveness in teams. Come on. How do you enhance processes and effectiveness? And you know what? There's timings running this. I'm going to need to stop. This is why my preference is to always use my own technology and not somebody else's manually. Okay. Talk about some science considerations, and I will close with some concepts around leadership and how leaders can not only build teams but also shape systems. So a lot depends on where you are in the organization. So let's talk a little bit about organizations. They are multi-level systems. You heard this yesterday if you were here when Jennifer talked about this from a community perspective. But basically, a couple of key concepts there is that organizations are enacted. Right? There's a context, it's a property of both the person and the situation, and they work together to create the experience that we're having. Organizations are abstract systems. You study cells, for example, if you're a biologist, those are concrete systems. There are structures in the cell that have functions. Organizations do not have structures that correspond directly with functions. Functions are created by people. So really they exist in our heads. We enact them, we create them. That means they're both very malleable, but if you don't understand them, very difficult to change. The other important principle here is that organizations have two primary forces, top-down and bottom-up. Let me tell you a little bit about that. So you heard about this yesterday as well, but basically organizations are layered or nested systems. You're an individual, you have jobs and functions to perform in them, but you're going to do it in a more micro context, that is the context of teams. It's a primordial social unit. But teams and individuals are going to be impacted by higher levels of the systems. Policies, practices, procedures, leadership, culture, climate. These are forces that act to constrain and shape those lower levels of the systems. But by the same token, there are phenomena that are created by the interactions among individuals, particularly team processes that I'm going to talk about, that are really important for the stuff it is that organizations do, the output. So both of those are important. And these bottom-up processes tend to be a little bit more difficult to get your hands or your heads wrapped around it. They're emergent. They take place over time. In the work that I've done, Catherine Klein and I define it as emergent phenomena are those that originate in the cognition, affect, behavior, other characteristics of individuals, personality, value, etc. They're amplified and shaped by their interactions and also by that top-down context, and then they manifest as these higher-level collective phenomena. I'll talk about that with respect to teams, but these are things like the cognitive structures that help drive team coordination, motivational and affective structures that bond people and energize them, and the behaviors that are responsible for actually getting stuff done. So here's kind of a notional representation of what we mean by emergence. We have Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie down there in the lower corner. They're people, they're entities. We're going to see that phenomena take time to emerge, and they transcend levels from bottom up. And during that, there are process mechanisms that are driving the interactions and exchange among individuals. These are driven by psychology. And then are these contextual influence that shape the nature of emergence. And some of the process phenomena we're going to talk about, when they take on this more or less stable characteristics, are things that are convergent, shared understandings, consensus, shared knowledge that we can collectively access, and other things that are more patterned or configural, like the distribution of knowledge and being able to know who you can talk to or access for that knowledge, that's a pattern versus something that's more held in common. And basically, if we're talking about this from a more organizational systems perspective, leaders play a really important role in creating alignment from top down to bottom up and across layers of the system. And you can think about this as, at a very broad level, being clustered into what I would characterize as technostructural technologies and structures that are going to link how people work together, as well as enabling processes, what it is that they're going to do to actually execute across cognition, motivation, and behavior. So those are the unity, if you will, of the top down and bottom up. The other part of this, then, as you move down to a more team-centric focus, are task and time. So there are workflows. How is work organized within teams or whatever the units are that you're building your organization out from? And here, what you have across the bottom are different models of workflow. These are kind of idealized, not like everything fits exactly this framework. But on the far left, you have simple mechanisms like pooled. People work more or less in parallel, and then they add stuff up at the end, and it gets combined, or some simple series of activities. You process one, it moves on to somebody else. Reciprocal workflows where there's some interaction or feedback between different nodes in the network. And then on the far right, your right, complex, where you have different and flexible and adaptive workflows that pretty much have to shift depending on the nature of the problem, which is more or less the kind of workflows that are most likely going to be relevant for those of you who are planning these centers. Those complexities for the internal relationships are often coupled with the external environment. So you've got more synchronous linkages internal, but it also means that you're more tightly coupled to other teams or to other parts of the system working on the same problem space. And so if we think about what it is that teams need to do, there's an environment, it's a problem, it's the task environment, and it creates attributes on the task that the team has to perform, right? The nature of the workflows and the problems that have to be resolved. Enabling processes are those things, team processes that people do to combine their intellect, their effort, their behavior to resolve those task inputs. And you get some kind of output. This is iterative. It has an influence on making the problem simpler or making the problem more complicated, changing the task attributes. People have to adapt processes, et cetera. This is intended to represent that this is a dynamic process, not a static one. And so the enabling processes are a big deal, because if you've got them aligned with the task problem, you have an output on the performance end that helps resolve the problem that you're trying to deal with. If they're not well aligned, then you're suboptimal, or the team may even fail. So I was on this consensus committee on enhancing the science of team science. My role on that committee is somebody who studies the science of team effectiveness and trying to bring that knowledge to the science of teams. So I'm going to now give you kind of a whirlwind tour of some of the process mechanisms that are important or relevant for you to think about if you're trying to build teams or if you're at a higher level trying to build a system of teams. We're going to focus on these emergent processes as kind of key mechanisms, and then what are some of the things that can be done to influence those processes. The findings that I'm going to relate to you, yes, at a very quick and high level, are those things that can guide application and intervention. I'm not going to really talk much about the gaps, but obviously the gaps are what would drive future work in my domain. So it's useful to think about, or at least acknowledge, what the heck are we talking about when we talk about teams, because I find that people map lots of different social entities onto this. So here's a set of boundaries that you might use to think about what work teams are. So they're two or more individuals, and really they're not of infinite size. There's no upper limit that's specified, but Miller's 7 plus or minus 2 is a good rule of thumb for how big your teams are likely to be. If they get much bigger than that, they'll self-organize into smaller units to make it more manageable. They interact face-to-face or perhaps virtually. They have one or more common goals. They exist to perform tasks. They're not social groups. You're pulling them together because they have expertise and there's some outcome that they're after. They have interdependencies around goals, how the work is connected, any outcomes, and typically differentiated roles around that expertise. They're embedded in this broader system, and there are boundaries and linkages to both that system and a task environment that's created, which I've tried to illustrate. So back to, you've seen this, right? We've got the dynamics running around this system. So in terms of trying to understand, well, how can we enhance team effectiveness? Then one good place to start is to identify in the literature, got some 70 years of research to look over, what are the team processes that seem to have a reliable relationship with team effectiveness? And then having identified, sifting through literally thousands of studies, try to identify what are the factors that can be used to shape and align those processes. So that's what I'm going to give you a quick sketch of. Notionally at a high level, you can say, okay, well, we've got these things clustered around cognition, motivation, and behaviors. The targeted processes, which I'm going to take you through in a little bit of detail, and then some of the interventions, focusing primarily in this talk on training and development, particularly as it's leveraged by team leaders. So let's talk about cognitive process mechanisms. One is team climate. This tends to be somewhat higher level, and this is where if you're leading an organization, it's really important. We heard in the last talk, it's about the vision. It's having a compelling set of strategic imperatives. What is it that gets people engaged and excited about being there, looking beyond their own self-interest? You need to align the system to support those strategic imperatives. If it's misaligned, people will not work toward those goals. There's learning. How do you get people to learn and orient in a collective way? A lot of this has to do with how errors are treated and acknowledged. So you need to be able to acknowledge errors. You need to be able to break them down. People need to be open to feedback. Leaders are critical for modeling what you do when mistakes happen and what we do about it. If you're going to be angry about mistakes, no learning will take place. People will avoid. If you're going to be open, not because we love errors, but we want to learn from the errors and mistakes, then you create an environment where people will correct each other openly, and they will help enhance the team and the system to learn. Knowledge building. Yesterday, Dean took you through an exercise. He distributed information according to expertise and role. You had to discuss that information and put it together and come to a consensus decision. This is a very common problem in organizations and in science. And so the real key here is how do you bring out the unique information? There was a lot of common information that everyone knew about, but every role had some unique information, and the correct solution was one that leveraged that unique information. This is studied, thousands of studies on something called the hidden profile, where the hidden information is embedded in a task. And the common finding in the research is that teams fail to surface and or then discuss and integrate that unique information. So the teams that succeeded were the ones that surfaced that information and incorporated it into the decision. Think about being on a multi or interdisciplinary team. This is going to be a primary problem. How do you promote that? And a real key is you've got to get that unique information out there. So knowledge building. And then a couple other cognitive structures. One are shared knowledge, team mental models about what it is that people know in common so they can more or less anticipate and implicitly coordinate. And then transactive memory, which is more about the distributed expertise. People need to know who knows what, but then they can access that expertise. Now the problem here is that people know a lot more than just the label of their role or their discipline or their science. So how do you get to know people at that deeper level so you can access and make utilization of that knowledge? This is particularly important as you move down to being a team leader. We talk about motivational and affective process mechanisms. So team cohesion is the glue that bond members together, and it's about the team and the tasks that they perform. Right? So having a social bonding with the members. So this is knowing a little bit more about people and their demographics or surface features that they present, or their discipline. It's about getting to know them as people, their personality, their values. This is what bonds members together. You do this through time. You do this through exercises where people can disclose and have opportunities to interact informally. And it's about task. It's about being committed to the task and being able to marshal your energy and effort. Team efficacy. This is confidence, essentially, that one can accomplish your individual goals, but for the team, it's about a collective sense that the team is going to be confident that it can accomplish the goals that it's been assigned to in a time frame that it has. Leaders can help leverage this through simple persuasion by giving people opportunities to demonstrate their capabilities and having small win successes as they work toward that goal and build that sense of capability. We can do it above and beyond. And to the extent that you have conflicts, which is almost inevitable, There's task, what are we doing? Process, how are we doing it? And relationship. Task and process are things that are malleable that you should manage. Relationship conflict, you want to try to suppress. You don't want to have task and process conflicts turn into relationship conflicts because those are really difficult to resolve once they get manifest. And then behaviors. This is about coordination, collaboration, communication. A lot of these science teams do not have what I'll call well-devised or designed or rational workflow structures that somebody has mapped out. They're emergent. People work them out on their own. So you need to attend a little bit to making sure that those mappings are rational, that you have some sense of what they are, what they're doing, and whether there might not be better ways of connecting people together. There are competencies. There were questions about how you pick team members. Obviously, the most important thing are their knowledge, skills, and abilities relevant to the role, the expertise that they need to fulfill on your team. But of course, it's really good if they play nice with others. So thinking about personality and values and past experiences that will predispose them to a higher orientation toward the collective and not just their own egos. And then team regulation, which is a concept of thinking about this gets into learning, motivation, and performance. There's goals, there's effort, there's some kind of information or feedback about progress toward goals. There's some diagnostics if we're not making progress at the rate at which we desire, or if we're making mistakes, what can we do to change what we're doing, change the strategy, change the effort, modify the goal, and iterate. Leaders can help inculcate this kind of process mechanisms within their teams. You have weekly project meetings. This can inform a little bit about some of the inquiry that ought to structure those project meetings. Now, the thing about science teams is I'm told that they're really different. They're scientists. They're not like people in organizations. Well, I would say they're complicated, but they're still teams. We don't need a separate entire science that doesn't also take advantage of what we already know from the research. So they tend to be more heterogeneous. Certainly if we're talking about transdisciplinary teams, that's a given. But it also means they'll be multicultural, multiracial, mixed gender. They're going to have lots of surface differences, and it's going to make it harder to work with those people, to communicate and collaborate, et cetera. So these are important things to work at the team building stage. They could be mega, but that means you need to build an actual organization. It's not one giant team. You need to make sure that goals are aligned. This is very important for senior team leadership to be working on. I'll talk a little bit about that. Members move in and out. That means you have to have renewal mechanisms to socialize new people as they come in. And that task interdependence, as I already talked about, is likely to be high, so things are complicated. So this is a classic concept, treating team leaders as linking pins. So you can think of organizations as horizontal. Right? This differentiates around expertise or units or functions, and so this is where the silos come from, and so we create some kind of hierarchical structure, which is an effort for integration. But the integration comes from team leaders providing that linkage. So you may be a team leader, but that means you're a subordinate or a follower on some higher level team. And that means that as a senior leader, if you want to create alignment in a system, it's about how you influence the lower level leaders in the system as well. You have to be thoughtful about those top-down mechanisms, and you have to be an active communicator in keeping the system linked. Also, since we're talking about centers and universities, they don't always conform to a strict hierarchical structure, or perhaps there is one, but we don't care. And so you might think about alternatives, right? So here we have the all-knowing leader who's going to be directive, but of course things don't really work that way because we are bottom-up in the way we do things. And so alternatives would be to think about these systems as being networks of teams, or what some people would characterize as multi-team systems. And so it's more about how do you link different teams together, and sometimes if you get a bunch of teams in different functional areas, how you cross the boundaries. The last speaker was talking about, from his experience, Cato, how do you create some of those linkages, right? So having liaison roles, thinking about which teams need to be linked together, who's responsible for those linkages, so that there's an awareness. This is what links between teams or across your differentiated units. And then within teams, you can have diversity based on discipline and all the other differences that might be apparent to us when we get together on a team. And there's this concept of fault lines, of how members can fracture simply based on these differences and kind of clump up around those things that make them alike. So it could be across gender boundaries or disciplinary boundaries or age boundaries or racial boundaries or any number of characteristics. And certain cluster of these will have the potential to cleave teams, and this is pretty well established. And so an important thing for a leader is to identify those things that connect people and cut across those potential fault lines. And this is something that leaders would do early on in the formation of teams. We need a team identity. We need to be united around why we're here and what we're doing, not the discipline, the differences that distinguish us. So you can think about this, or at least from my perspective, that leaders have some distinctive roles in promoting team development. Yesterday, you heard about Tuckman's classic model, forming, storming, norming, and performing. And while that is wonderful and those words roll off and it's easy to remember, there's not a lot of actionable content beneath it. We have more contemporary theories that are linked to more, let's call it a deeper literature that can give you some tools or insights about how do you actually go about managing this. So in the beginning, you think about the leaders having this role of promoting a developmental sequence. The goal is to get a group of differentiated individuals who are coming together for this task and get them to work as a self-managing, autonomous, more or less independent entity that's collectively motivated to accomplish tasks. And at the end, your goal as leader is to negotiate with the external environment, make sure they have the resources and the information that they need to get things done. How do you do that? This idea of a regulatory cycle or process. Okay, I'm good. So you have early goals that you're trying to set to help the team learn about working together. The team's going to engage in some activity. As a leader, you're trying to watch what's going on, develop some diagnostics about what you can do to help provide process feedback about what we might do better. By the way, it's not you as leader who's responsible for identifying exactly what's wrong, but leading the process that gets the team to diagnose so they can think about what they might do better in the future, shifting strategies, modifying goals, changing the workflow, et cetera. Increment the goal, monitor, and keep cycling through. So it's important to think about what are the time frames around which you might have a cycle. For some teams, it's built into their task. You know, if you're on a medical trauma team, there's a patient, you set some goals, you operate on the patient, the attending steps in if you're going to kill the patient or give some advice to the resident, and then there's a debrief after that, what would we do better next time? Your science team, the time cycle might unfold a little bit slower, maybe it's organized around your project meetings, but all tasks have an ebb and flow of some sort. Sometimes it's imposed. Think about how you're going to harness that to accomplish your role as a team leader at whatever level in the organization. So the idea is that you take teams through a process. If it's a new startup, the beginning is basically melding people to the team and its tasks. This is where the strategic imperatives from the top need to come down into a particular team. Here's the overall goal. What does that mean for our part in it? Where do we fit? What are our somewhat smaller goals, but they're linked and aligned with that larger goal? And what's the atmosphere like in here? We need to bond together. We need to have an identity. Cato was talking about naming his teams. These simple tools are very powerful. You put people in a room and they're different, and you give them different colored t-shirts, and they will glom together with their color. So give your team a name, give them an identity, give them a tagline. These things are simple, and they sound soft, but they're very important to help people understand who we are and why we're there. Right? So you're trying to build that shared affect, attitudes, bond together. What are our goals? Where do we fit? People need to have a sense of competence and confidence that comes with that. So opportunities to demonstrate their capability. If we're on a new team and what are we going to do? Circulate our vita? I mean, we need to have some kind of description where we can present our expertise and then some early wins where we can demonstrate our competency. Cato talked about how he gauges whether he's going to work on a collaboration. If you're a team leader, you're giving people things to do. This is a testing to see will they fulfill. You know, what can you expect of people? And trying to do it in a way that's mutually supportive so that people are going to succeed, not fail. And as people develop that self-efficacy, they can begin to focus on team efficacy. These are now the collective focus. How are we going to work together? Now that I'm shown my own capabilities, who am I coordinating with? What are the new connections? Where am I being stretched? How are we going to work that out? How are we going to share that knowledge? So trying to work out these now more team-level shared mental models, transactive memory, coordination or collaboration mechanisms. Right? The leader is facilitating, not directing. You're allowing members to work this out, but you're trying to create the stage where that will take place. And then in this final stage, it's as leader as facilitator. Really doing more about helping to manage the relationship of that team with other teams to the extent that's necessary, with higher levels of the system, with goals, with problems. Can you problem solve so it doesn't trickle down to the team? Interfere, make sure the resources flow, not have them diverted. So the role of the leader then, the team's, doing the work. The role of the leader is to help them protect and marshal and move the team along in its accomplishment, help it be adaptive. So there are some leadership theory or I'll call them tools or concepts that can provide some advice from a broader perspective. So we talk about this idea of visioning, having a compelling vision that can engage members to think about being motivated beyond their self-interest, having a collective orientation. There's something called transformational leadership, and it's oriented around that, creating the vision, engaging people's motivating potential. There are theories around relational leadership. How do you craft roles and relationships? This is a developmental process where there's some testing and role building. I mean, my best people, graduate students on projects, have proven through this testing process that I can give them a somewhat ill-defined goal with not much information about how to proceed, and they'll go and do stuff. And then I can help adjust their progress. I might have other people that, unless I give them very specific instructions, step by step of what they're going to do, I'm not going to get what I want as a product. Okay, that's how it's going to work. So some people get this kind of latitude to negotiate a broad role, and they're going to be my trusted insiders. And some folks will do stuff, but only if it's mapped out. That's fine, I can harness that. I just need to know what it is they're going to do. It may need to be broken down, and I may need to monitor that, but a leader can work with that. It means that you may not manage everybody in exactly the same way. You've got to tailor it to the individual capabilities. There's a concept, particularly around team leadership, called functional leadership. So it's really important because it is not the leader's job to direct and do everything. The leader's role is basically to make sure that important things get done, not to do it. So it means crafting it within the team so members are accomplishing those objectives or functions are being accomplished for task accomplishment and functioning or relationships within the team, but not necessarily that the leader is trying to be the end-all and be-all of how it gets done. And then a related concept of shared leadership, and this is really, really important in science teams where, at some level faculty are faculty, you're a full professor, it's the best job in the world. And so the challenge is managing a bunch of egos where there's not really a higher level structure that can impose a whole lot of direction. So it means this concept of shared leadership, allowing people to take on leadership roles or functions that marry up with their expertise, with their role in the project. And so you can think of this kind of shared leadership as something that is distributed and dynamically shifts across the team as certain phases of solving a problem inculcate one person's expertise more than another, right? So it's not there being directive, but being more responsible for setting how we're going to go about accomplishing the next phase of our project, and recognizing that as some sort of formal or official leader, that your role is to facilitate and allow it to happen, not to direct it. So it's crafting and creating the environment where those things can take place. So there's a wealth of solid research out there, 70+ years of research on science, on the science of team effectiveness. We have a lot of actionable knowledge. Yes, there are things we don't know. Yes, there are complications when you go into science teams. But on the science level of this, there's evidence behind it and a lot of tools available to help provide guidance for how you can help build appropriate team processes around particularly team leadership, also team training. And I didn't talk about team design because I know that's going to be one of the issues that the panel will take up at the end. So I'm not sure where I am on time, but I think there's time for questions. Thanks very much. I am happy to take questions.
Thank you, Steve. Questions from the audience?
Yeah, thank you for the excellent presentation. Question is, certainly when you're forming the ERC, you really need to have these tools. Is it also true that as you're going through, you should kind of have a team scientist on the team to make sure that everything is someone to help you resolve these type of issues, or?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, bear in mind, I'm not a practitioner, so this isn't my role. You know, I don't sit in that. I'm engaged in work that's multidisciplinary myself, on a small scale, I would say, right? Working with engineers to help astronauts get to Mars someday, working with medical folks on trauma teams so that trauma team physicians can be better leaders of teams, with the military to have systems of teams that work effectively. And I would simply say that, you know, in the beginning, formation is one of the hardest things, particularly if you're talking about who do you pick. So you rely on expertise, and then a lot of the rest of this is a bit, particularly for folks out there, going to be nuanced. I will tell you there are assessments that can be conducted. You know, we can measure personality. We know a little bit about what works together and what doesn't. I will tell you that typically that's not done, this kind of formal assessment, but there are tools out there that can be utilized. But having formed a team, this is what you have now. As somebody asked in a question, once you have the team together, it's not really easy to knock people off and bring new people in. And as you go along, it gets a little bit more disruptive to do that, although that's going to be a fact of life. So it's useful to have somebody there to help manage the different phases of team life. I would say, you know, depending on the length of a center's lifetime, you know, what its life cycle is, there may come a point where the team is mature enough and systems are in place that you may not need that spirit guide to help you manage team processes. But getting a team to that point, or a system of teams to that point, it would be useful to have some guidance when problems, and there are inevitable problems when they arise. So I think the advice around that is really well-intentioned and a good idea. There's a mic over here, or over there.
Yeah, thanks. Very nice presentation. Could you comment on virtual teams, the fact that we're often very geographically distributed? We have technology for conferencing. Some people are better at it than others. Some fields are better at it than others. Any advice on that?
So it makes everything harder. I mean, my own research, I have 3 projects, and every one of them has a virtual component. Some people are distributed. We have decent technology today that's relatively inexpensive, and it's awesome. So you can utilize that. But it makes if you're the leader and you're trying to do and manage some of the processes I've talked about, obviously it's more difficult because a whole segment of process is invisible to you. What do? Well, you try to set up some structures where you can at least get proxies or indirect assessments of similar sorts of things. So for me, you have project meetings. Every project, we're managing to a set of goals. So things we talked about last week become what we're going to talk about this week. People had responsibilities that they were going to accomplish. They did or they didn't. If they did, what happened? Or they couldn't, what was it? So there's all this diagnostic, right? And you're managing that. So getting people to have accepted rules around communication and coordination. You may have weekly meetings, but if you've got a problem for a sub-team or some of your virtual folks, they need to be communicating with you or with other people more frequently, so it's not a surprise a week later or at some quarterly report time where people didn't get stuff done. So it makes the leader's task a little bit more challenging because you have to perhaps add additional mechanisms on top of what you might ordinarily be able to do easily in a face-to-face meeting or walk down the hallway to chat with somebody, but it's basically the same things you're trying to accomplish. You just may be doing it in ways that require more communication or technology-mediated communication. And I will tell you that in the research on virtual teams, one of the things that's very clear-cut is that shared leadership adds above and beyond these other forms of leadership in helping those teams be more effective. Right, this idea of distributing responsibilities and letting other members of the team lead as necessary becomes really important. And so part of the role of the leader is to help promote that, but then have the tools in place that sharedness is apparent, right? That those processes that you can't see get revealed or externalized in some way.
So the premise underlying most of what we've been talking about here seems to be that the team has a grand challenge or a goal that they're all working on different aspects of, and they're all working towards together. But I see part of what we're planning, at least a lot of these groups are planning, is building little science ecosystems where the auxiliary things that come out that may not, you may not see that goal. It may be something that someone, it's a discovery, the spark, or the auxiliary thing that happens. How do you create this infrastructure and this team structure? How do you envision integrating those auxiliary advances into the team structure and leadership goals?
This is where communication becomes really important, right? And this is why part of the task of being the leader is you're building a climate, a set of strategic imperatives that have openness. It's very important. We have this grand challenge. So this is going to really drive the clear goals, goal alignment through the system. This is what we're driving toward. Yes, interesting things are going to happen. How do you bring that back into and enrich? Or quite frankly, some of it may just be it spins off because it's its own thing and it really doesn't fit with what the primary objective was. So this is why if you're senior leaders, you get paid the big bucks, or at least you have the high-level status of running the center, is being sensitive to what can be brought in that enriches what we're after and what needs to have its own life, and it needs to be decoupled and spun off.
So I guess I have a question more along the lines of, managing time. Over here.
Thank you.
Time and sort of, leadership in terms of, what size team can a single leader manage effectively, and how to set up a structure if you do delegate and have other people step up and do shared leadership. Are there best practices? Is there some guidance? And also, how much time does this take? What should people be prepared for in terms of time commitment that they're going to be sinking into this?
So there's no consensus on size, right? In the science of team science, there's this, I will call it a myth because I disagree, but you can have teams of thousands. They're organizations. They may be poorly designed, but they're organizations. What we would observe descriptively is roughly somewhere around 5 to 10 people are going to be on a team, and if they get much bigger, they'll break up on their own. So you can have an administrative unit called a team, but it's not going to function as a single entity. And so that if you're trying to manage that, obviously you have some incorrect assumptions, so things won't work for you. So it's good to know exactly what the workflow is like and how people have clustered on your team. In terms of time is an unknown. It's an unknown. So all I can tell you is, most of the theories really are very agnostic at best about time. So we just don't have a lot of descriptive information. I will tell you from experience that most things take a lot longer than you anticipate. I had a mentor in graduate school who said, estimate how long you think it'll take and multiply by 3. And that's a really good rule of thumb. So it takes more time than you'd like and more time than you expect, and I think it's just useful to try to anticipate some slack when you're building that in. And learn. Most of you in a room are engineers and scientists. You're not trained to be leaders. You're not trained to build teams. You're maybe not even trained in a way to be a good team member. I know I certainly wasn't. And faculty are not the best people necessarily to be leaders or teammates. But these are very malleable skills that we can learn how to do, and it's very clear that to do the big science that we want to accomplish, we have to work together. And so I think making sure that people have an awareness of that and that they're truly motivated and energized by the grand challenge and by the broader goal, even as it's a smaller part of the organization, is a really big deal for getting the engagement that you need. One thing I'll mention that I didn't mention in the talk that I think is really important to bear in mind as a leader is if your teammates are being drawn from the university as the primary organization and you have a center that's somehow separate but it's really kind of connected, then your team members are really only partially included in your organization and they're partially included in the other. And when push comes to shove, it's the university connections or tentacles that are going to be stronger. Your center could be ephemeral, who knows? So the only thing that you have, because you don't have special rewards, you may have some resources that look attractive, but it's that vision and the opportunity to do some cutting edge science that keeps them connected. And as a center leader, you've got to keep their eye focused on that ball.
Thank you, Steve, for a really terrific talk.
Thank you.